Hello and welcome to the Neurologic podcast, coming to you from the UT Dallas Center for Vital Longevity, which is dedicated to pursuing research that leads to cognitive health for life. Our goal is to educate you on the latest matters relating to cognition and the brain, and with each episode we will be interviewing leading scientists and sharing their insights and suggestions to promote cognitive health throughout the lifespan. My name is Amber Kidwai.
And my name is Sarah Munir.
And this is Neurologic.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. On today's episode, we're talking about decision making. Most of the time, we don't even notice just how many decisions we're making all day.
And the choices we make aren't always as rational as we think. They're influenced by many hidden factors like our emotions, moral beliefs, identity, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are.
We also talk about something called reward discounting, why quick, easy rewards are often more tempting than waiting longer for a bigger reward, and how this influences the decisions we make.
We also discuss the speed-accuracy trade-off and why making rush decisions usually means making more mistakes.
And of course, we can't talk about decision making without bringing up dopamine, everyone's favorite neurochemical, and the role it plays in risk-taking and motivation.
We also discuss how age and social context change the way we make decisions, and why older adults might be better at resisting social pressure than younger adults.
And finally, we have a very interesting discussion on how biases can influence the decisions that jurors make, which can literally determine someone's fate.
We hope you enjoy listening to this episode. Let's get into it. Dr. Castrellon, thank you so much for being here today. Can you tell us about your background and what got you interested in studying decision making?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. So I was really actually originally interested in psychology and neuroscience more broadly because of my interest in studying the legal system. Originally, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, but I was also really interested in just human behavior more broadly. And when I was an undergraduate student at University of Southern California, I had a chance to start getting involved with research that really had strong ties to understanding the law. So at that point, we were looking at false memory and how does that connect to eyewitness testimony. And from there, I just sort of dove deeper and deeper into cognitive neuroscience and asking really interesting questions and thinking about how decision-making might play a greater role in people's day-to-day lives and how decision-making affects the way they interact with the legal system. So then when I went to extend this training, I went to Vanderbilt University to do a post-baccalaureate research position. And what was exciting about that place is that they have a law and neuroscience center, and so I was able to take courses by law professors who are interested in neuroscientific questions, people who are interested in thinking about how the brains of criminals can help inform our policies, or how does juror decision-making affect the way we think about the justice system. And so that really was a spark for me, and thinking about social decision-making more broadly. I then did my graduate training at Duke University, and so most of my work was studying decision-making quite broadly, but I was able to work with a team of scientists where we examined how jurors process different kinds of information and how they're biased by factors like how severe a crime is. After my graduate training at Duke, I then went to University of Pennsylvania, where I completed my postdoctoral training, and I'm currently now at UCLA.
So we're pretty much making decisions all day and constantly weighing the options that we have. But what I find both fascinating and a little unsettling is how much our choices are influenced by biases that we might not even be aware of. Some decision-making theories talk about the role of our emotions and then moral judgments and the way we think about people and groups, or what you call social cognition, and how these shape our choices. So could you tell us a bit more about this?
So like you said, there's all kinds of factors that can affect and bias someone's choices. One of those things you mentioned is emotions. At least in the example I talked about earlier in thinking about juror decision-making, we know that when jurors are reading graphically described crimes, it totally influences and biases their judgments about guilt. And we can actually see that in the brain. So that's just one example of how emotions, for example, influence it. In the research that I've done, we've shown that severe crimes are something that really biases people's choices to say whether or not a certain criminal scenario has lots of evidence. So even if you haven't heard any evidence yet, just knowing that it's a severe crime is enough to bias you. And we think that this has to do with the way people are mentalizing or thinking about other people's thoughts. This could be the thoughts of defendants or the thoughts of victims. So there's a lot of things that are running through someone's mind, like you said, emotions and other people's experiences.
So when you talk about severe crimes, do you mean like a murder versus like a speeding ticket? Or do you mean a speeding ticket that's described in a very severe manner?
That's a great distinction, yes.
Yeah.
So there's both actually. So the first I was talking about graphic language.
Yeah.
That would be a speeding ticket described graphically.
Yeah.
But then the work that we've shown is that there are actually just differences. The moment you walk into a courtroom and you're told that you're being asked to judge the fate of someone accused of murder, you are already biased in a way that's not like the way someone who's walking into a courtroom and told they're making a judgment about someone who, like you said, got a speeding ticket.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of this bias comes from like our moral judgment, or is it more about like I know one of the areas that you've looked at is like the narrative or what we're telling ourselves about hearing the facts and making the story based on our moral judgment. So does that kind of tie into this crime type bias you're talking about?
Yeah, so this crime type bias that we found actually is not so much tied to people's moral beliefs as you might have assumed. It seems to be really driven by people's past experiences and knowledge, for example. So one thing that our lab wants to start investigating is what are the kinds of crimes that people have experienced in their day-to-day lives? Are those the things that people are more familiar with? And could the familiarity, for example, of a crime be something that pushes someone to say, this is more severe? And, just as an example, the kinds of crimes that you hear about in the news are typically the ones that are more severe. You don't typically hear about the shoplifting cases or someone operating an unlicensed distillery. The ones that you hear about are capital crimes and murder. And so those are the ones that are probably more likely to be resting in multiple people's minds as a bias in general.
Very interesting. So when we're making decisions like in our everyday life, we're usually weighing cost and benefits, like we talked about, of the different choices. And according to research and some of the things that you've looked at, many of us have this tendency to favor the smaller but more immediate reward that's kind of easier to get rather than waiting for maybe a bigger reward later on that's less certain. So for example, if you were to offer me $50 today instead or $100 like a week from now, a lot of us have this tendency to go for this smaller, more immediate reward. And this is something that's called reward discounting. So can you talk more about that and what you found in your research about this?
Right. So you're right. This is reward discounting, and people have these preferences not just for money and not just for time. We see that this same kind of decision process is shown when people are making decisions about, for example, hypothetical rewards. In one of the experiments that I had done with collaborators, we asked people to make judgments about receiving hypothetical amounts of time spent with a close loved one. And would you rather spend 10 minutes with them now or 30 minutes with them in a week? We also asked them about different kinds of hypothetical health rewards. So we tell them, there's a super pill that's going to make you live longer, feel better, basically a cure-all for everything. And we find again there that people have preferences and they vary in whether or not they want a little bit of that pill now or a lot of it later. So it doesn't matter the kind of reward itself, or even if we're looking about uncertainty. So whether or not the reward is uncertain or more certain, or if it requires people to expend some amount of effort or put some more thought into it, people vary. And so like you said, some people have a preference for going for the easier option, is one way to say it. And this preference for the easier option is believed to underlie all kinds of things that cut across personality and psychopathology. So not just how people think and feel and go about in their day-to-day lives, but maybe might be related to some kind of clinical symptoms that people might be exhibiting. And that would be, for example, like on the more extreme end of things.
So what are some of the things that can influence whether somebody discounts more? So what about factors like sleep, stress, your mood during the time pressure? So do all of these factors come into play when we have this tendency to kind of go for these more immediate rewards?
They do, and it's really sometimes a challenge for us to isolate the contributions of all of these different things because they're all playing a role at once. So, for example, time pressures, like you imagine, those are things that are really seeding in people's minds, along with the availability and scarcity of resources. So if you just know that some amount of money won't be available to you later, then it really just sort of makes sense and it's rational to take it now. And so there are lots of cases where those sorts of conditions and contexts might have a greater impact than someone's personality or personal preferences. And that's when, these things sort of vie out for each other.
And I'm sure like what also comes into play is how the choice is framed. So for example, if you were to tell someone, this has a 90% success rate versus telling them this has a 10% failure rate, then that might influence how they're making that decision.
That's right. So we do see that people have these sorts of biases about the sorts of information that's made available to them. And people might have a sort of preference for the more certain option. And just the way that you say it. There's all kinds of little tricks and things that we can do as scientists to push and pull people's choices. For example, one thing you can do is you can change the way you describe your time delays. So there's a difference between when you tell somebody 1 week versus 7 days, or 1 year, versus 365 days. Those little cues right there are things that people care about, and it does show an ability to move their choices.
Yeah, and I think you kind of touched on this also, but there's a lot of subjective differences in the value of something. So, for example, maybe making $100 for one person is, nothing much added to their income, but for someone else, it's the difference of whether or not they're making rent that day or groceries. So I'm sure that value-based, the subjective value of something, it also influences decisions.
That's right. So, and that subjective value that you're describing can be influenced by these sorts of socioeconomic factors. And those are things that are completely independent of their personality or any kind of pathology that you might see in specific kinds of individuals. And so, like I said, like this context and need is something that's also really important for us to consider whenever we study this. And so we try to study a pretty diverse group of people, and we sample people across the adult lifespan so we can really try to capture as much of the possible variability that there could be.
So how much do we rely on our past experiences when we're making a decision in the moment or evaluating the expected value of a choice?
That's a great question. To say how much we rely on it, what I would speculate is that it really depends on the amount of information that we have in the moment. So the more information you have that's new for you to sample, most humans are going to use that new information. But if you don't have a lot of information available to you, well, then you kind of sort of fall back to your initial biases. And that's how a lot of these biases operate. When you first encounter some kind of decision, all you have is what you know. And so that's what's really informing your first choice. But once you get some feedback and say like, oh, wow, that decision worked out well. Making that choice was great. Now you have new information, and that's what should be driving your choices. And that initial bias that you had should play less of a role. But starting out, your personal experiences, your knowledge, your history, anything you know, that's what's probably having the biggest effect.
So what is the speed-accuracy trade-off in decision-making?
So the speed-accuracy trade-off is something that we investigate in our lab using computational models. And what this is that there are trade-offs in the efficiency with which people make their choices. We sometimes ask participants to try to make choices that are going to be providing them with the best outcome. But we can also instruct them to try to make choices that are really fast. Now, once you start to make choices really fast, as many people might have experienced in their own lives, without thinking, you're probably not going to make the best choice in hindsight. And so we can investigate this sort of trade-off between the speed with which people make choices with how well they correspond to the benefit that they gain from that. Some people are really good at this. For example, we see that there are age-related differences in the speed-accuracy trade-off. Younger adults tend to be better at this. There's a lot of reasons for that. For example, faster motor functions. But as you get older, these motor functions start to slow down, and so you just have a slower speed. But you might still have a high accuracy. And so these things aren't necessarily non-independent. These things can be separated.
I mean, I would think intuitively that as you get older, your speed might increase because you have more experience. So you almost have, like you were saying before, you go to your previous knowledge first. So you've already made a certain decision in a certain way, certain times, you might just default to that, which would increase your speed, right? Versus a younger person who hasn't encountered it before.
They might take longer to weigh up the evidence.
Because they haven't experienced it.
Yes.
Whereas with motor function, obviously that's a specific thing, obviously, but in terms of general decision making. I don't know if you've had any experience with looking
Yes.
at the kind of that outside of the motor decision making, like with older adults and young adults.
Yeah. So in some of our data and data from others, we show that, for example, we would describe this as older adults becoming more cautious.
Yeah.
So they're still accurate. If anything, they're probably even more accurate, but they are slowed down. And they're waiting, so to speak, to make sure that they've made the right choice.
Okay, so they are more careful.
They're
They're
more
not
careful.
just like making snap judgments.
Right.
And
Exactly.
yeah, because we see that, I mean, we see that with a lot of scams too that prey on older adults and just like, make the decision quick. Like if you make the decision now, it'll be $100 less than if you wait. And I feel like a lot of older adults kind of have this susceptibility to scams such as that.
Yeah.
But I think from their day-to-day life, they tend to kind of take it slower.
Yeah. And I think some of the work which we're trying to study in our lab is that these sorts of susceptibility to scams may be less governed by the sorts of speed accuracy trade-offs, but more by people's increased trustingness
Oh, gotcha.
and preference to have some kind of social closeness to others.
So what are some of the brain regions that are involved in, our decision making and motivation, which also ties into decision making?
Yeah. So, it's an interesting question because what we see is that the whole brain's involved. It's never just one region. It's a coordinated action across a constellation of areas. So, for example, the ventral striatum is a really popular area for us to study because of its dense dopaminergic projections that it receives. So really highly innervated by the neurotransmitter dopamine, which we know is like really implicated in reward function. There's parts of the amygdala which are really important for choices and integrating emotional information into your choices. The ventral medial prefrontal cortex is considered this sort of integrating unit that helps us figure out what do we care about, what do we value. And then there's other regions like the anterior cingulate cortex that are really important for kind of feeding this output into motor function and making the actual choice that we want.
So what have you seen about dopamine's role in decision making? So have you looked at, for example, some individuals tend to make quicker decisions that are more risky. They're more prone to making these impulsive decisions versus others who kind of, what we were talking about, they tend to take a longer time to make a decision and be more accurate about it. So have you looked at dopamine differences between these types of individuals?
We have. And so some of the findings that we had initially were a little confusing because we weren't really finding the sorts of associations that you described. It seems to be a little bit more nuanced, more complex than that. It's not just the case that people who have more or less dopamine or more or less efficient dopamine signaling make more or less risky choices, but it's more like people who have more or less efficient dopamine signaling value the choices at hand differently. And they might be more or less sensitive to those values in different ways. So somebody who has really efficient dopamine signaling might be really good at telling the difference between the worth of option A versus option B, compared to somebody who might have less efficient dopamine signaling might see those two options as maybe more equal. And so choosing between the two doesn't really seem like a easy decision.
Right. So would one example be like how a person values maybe their social relationship versus like a monetary reward?
Exactly.
Would that tie into that as, yeah.
Yeah.
So you've done research on how social context can affect our self-control or our tendency to kind of conform to groups and how this changes from younger to older adults. So what did your research show about how who you're with and what they're doing influence our self-control, and do younger and older adults handle this social pressure differently?
Yeah, that's a really fun topic because this is really well studied in adolescents and in children. There's been lots of interest in understanding peer pressures in young adulthood, but less work has investigated this as people get older. I mean, older people have friends too. They're around other people too. And so we wanted to understand whether or not that sort of pattern that we see in adolescence in this decline in susceptibility to peer pressure continues into the aging trajectory. What we find is that actually, for the most part, that pattern does continue, meaning that as people get older, they are less susceptible, but not completely. We still find that some older adults are susceptible to peer pressure. There are lots of open questions for us that we're really interested in investigating, which are probably already coming up to mind for you. For example, who are these people that are around them? Are we susceptible to friends more than strangers? That's something that we're really interested in testing. But so far what we're seeing is that for the most part, older adults sort of gain a lot with their age, and that includes this ability to manage their self-control and kind of set aside any peer pressures in their area.
So they're better at controlling their desires, even when maybe somebody's enacting that desire they want.
Yeah, you can imagine
have that more
yourself.
Control.
Yeah, you can imagine yourself out with friends, and maybe all of your friends are getting drinks, and maybe a younger adult would be more likely to just also get a drink, even if they didn't initially think they wanted it. But we see that older adults would be more likely to maybe say, I'm not going to have a drink because I don't want to drink, and sort of standing their ground.
So social context and peer pressure can look different for teens and young adults than it does for older adults. So, for example, it's much more common for teens to experience peer pressure in the form of taunting, physical bullying, or group exclusion than it is for older adults. So when you say social context, does that mean just seeing others enacting the desired behavior, or does it also include more severe forms of peer pressure?
That's a really great question. So at least in the way that we've studied it, we've only so far looked at this sort of presence effect, like other people around you enacting the desire. But there are other ways where we can see this sort of peer pressure, I imagine, emerge. One thing that I think we're also interested in is not just these sorts of negative sides of peer pressure, but also the positive sides. There's really great work that showed, for example, that older adults are more likely to stick with a fitness program if it's a social program, if other people are also doing that too, and that's really great. So just because there's other people around them doesn't mean it has to be a bad decision outcome. And so that's something we really want to try to leverage and understand whether or not peer pressure can be used for good.
I mean, just like you were saying with older adults, they seem to value social contact more. That could be almost like a type of subtle peer pressure, right? Where okay, I want to be with these people. They all want to go to the gym. I guess I have to go to the gym too.
It's a double-edged sword. What are these friends doing?
Yeah.
So emotion regulation tends to improve with age, while some aspects of cognitive control actually decline. So does that play a factor in how decision-making changes as we age?
It does. The work that I've been involved with, we've shown that as people get older, they are more stable in their mood and generally more positive. And so we think that this should relate to the kinds of choices that they make in different risk-taking environments. Some of our collaborators have begun to show this, that, for example, the stability of someone's mood might relate to risk-taking, and that should be affected by age as well.
So kind of coming back to what we were talking about of peer pressure and social context, do older adults have this tendency to pick environments and people that better match their goals, so there's less pressure going into it and to start with, or are they just better at resisting in the moment, even if the environment is tempting?
Yeah, I love these questions so much because it gives us really great research questions to test next. So we didn't test that, we didn't ask that, but that's something we can do. And it would be really easy to inform it by our theories. So one of the theories that we are really interrogating in our lab is this idea of socio-emotional selectivity theory. And so what that means is that as people get older, they start to shift their priorities. They put a greater priority on the close people around them, friends and family, and really make an investment towards those people who mean a lot to them. And so what I would expect, or at least maybe hypothesize, is that as people get older, they might be selecting the kinds of environments that they put themselves in, so that way they are spending more time with close others and less time with people who are maybe new.
Yeah, because it's a question of if they're put into the same kind of tempting environment, are they better at, controlling that desire as well, which you talked about, you did find that, but I think they have more of this proactive action of choosing their social group better than a young adult.
Yeah, and so then maybe that depends on the individual. Perhaps older adult A is surrounds themselves with friends who are risk takers and base jumpers, and older adult person B over here is really surrounding themselves with a knitting community or something.
Right.
And there you can imagine very different kinds of choices that might emerge in those communities.
Yeah. So they have different goals and they're aligning their crowd to meet those goals they already have.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like with young people, especially if you're talking about teens, they probably don't have as much ability to pick their crowds in the sense that they have to go to school, they have to go to they're kind of put in environments, right? And so they are made to interact with everybody, whereas with the older adult, they are at a stage where they probably know themselves and they know that I like knitting or whatever, so I'm going to go with the knitting crowd versus the risk-taking crowd. And so it becomes like a self-fulfilling thing where you surround yourself with people who like the things you like. And so you know, you're less exposed to that peer pressure in the first place, or the negative peer pressure at least.
It really also gives us an opportunity to design really interesting experiments around college age. That's a really major opportunity and milestone in development, where now you're at a new place and you can pick your own friends and find your own community and do your own thing, so to speak.
So does the identity of the others matter? So whatever group is around you. So for example, if it's a partner, a close friend versus like a coworker, a stranger, and how an individual is handling this social pressure.
That's a great question. We are really interested in this. We haven't tested this explicitly. We haven't asked people who is around you. We think that people who are older in age might be more strongly influenced by people who are close to them, people like family or very close friends. And so that's our hypothesis, and we are definitely eager to test that.
Yeah, I'm also curious about like the role of social status in this. So if somebody is someone who we deem has a higher status is involved in the group, are you more likely to be peer pressured by them, even as an older adult?
It's a really interesting and tricky question, because there are all these different kinds of markers of status, for example. We have status, we have respect, we have power. All of these things have this sort of hierarchical dimension to them in society, but they mean different things to us. So people might have very different beliefs about whether or not they want to follow somebody who is really powerful or really intelligent, or so on. We can make a list of all the kinds of traits that people value. That's something we haven't investigated, but it's certainly something that we would expect to have some impact in people's decision making, since we know that those are qualities that people can ascribe value to.
So we discussed this a bit earlier, but I wanted to come back to the jury research that you did relating to how juries behave. And one of the very interesting studies that you did was looking at how biases can influence the decisions that jurors make, and how bias can literally determine someone's fate. So could you talk specifically about that study and what you found, where you were kind of scanning jurors' brains?
That's right. Yeah. So in that study, we recruited people in North Carolina. That's where we did the study at Duke University. They're jury eligible people, adults, and we asked them to read different crime scenarios, and along with different pieces of evidence. So some of the scenarios could be something like shoplifting or operating an unlicensed distillery, and some other crimes could be something like murder or other kinds of harm or illegal street racing. So they vary so much in the severity, and we also had measures of how well these severities line up with criminal code and statute. And then at the same time, after they read those crime scenarios, they were provided with pieces of evidence. So these could be eyewitness testimony, they could be physical evidence, DNA evidence, or maybe even someone's criminal history, and some sort of combination of all of those. And so in our set of studies, we found something interesting. Well, the first thing was that regardless of the kind of evidence that you read, we found that people were more strongly biased by the severity of the crime. And what I mean by that is that when we asked people after they viewed the scenario and the evidence, how much punishment does this crime deserve? How much evidence is there against the accused? How strong is the case? We asked people those questions. It's the crimes that were most severe that received the highest ratings. So you are told you're going to sit on a murder case, regardless of the evidence that we showed, people are more likely to say that there's a strong case against the accused.
So even if the evidence doesn't match up to it, let's say the evidence isn't as good as the lower rated crime, there's still more bias to have that opinion of this needs to be punished and et cetera, and make that conclusion.
Exactly. And then the second part of that study was that this was all done while people are undergoing an fMRI scan. And so one of our questions was whether or not there are specific brain regions that might be associated with this sort of bias. And what we found is that there's specific brain regions like the temporal parietal junction, and these temporal parietal junctions, or TPJs, are more commonly activated when people are thinking about others' thoughts and thinking about others' experiences. So
like empathy.
Yeah, it could be empathy. It could be really all kinds of things here. And so that's like our next question. So what are people thinking about? Are they thinking about the experience of defendants? Are they thinking about the experience of the victims? That's sort of like our lead into the studies we're currently developing to further investigate, what is it that people are thinking about naturalistically?
Yeah, super cool. So these brain patterns that you're seeing is one theory that they're linked to this kind of social cognition about how you think about groups and other people.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, we had some ideas about what this might be driven by. And, we asked, could this be moral judgment that people are engaging in? Is this all emotion? Is this more, like you said, something like social cognition? People are thinking about others' thoughts. And when we look at the past literature in the field in neuroscience, human neuroscience studies using fMRI, and we compared our maps to those maps, our maps did not look like maps like moral judgment or emotion. It really looked like people were thinking about others' thoughts and experiences. And specifically, it lined up with maps that are really associated with studies that were investigating biases and stereotypes and these really broader issues that do intersect with people's experiences in the legal system.
Right. Yeah, that's super scary at the same time, because you want to be as objective as you can in these kind of court cases, but these biases are just things that we can't get rid of. And these studies that you're doing and showing these brain regions activated is just kind of reinforcing that notion that biases are not something we can just remove.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, we can just try and be aware of them, I guess.
And that actually seems to be the best medicine by sort of informing people of their biases. That's one way to reduce them. So that's another part of our research that we're really interested in seeing if that might also have an effect on the fMRI signal that we're seeing. Could that also attenuate that too?
So kind of just reminding them beforehand, be aware of your biases going in, and seeing if that makes a difference.
Yeah, normalizing it for people. Let them know that these are things that are that most people have, that they walk into courtrooms with.
I feel like they should add that to jury training. Like
they should
let people know that language that's used is going to affect you, and your biases are going to affect you, and all that kind of stuff.
For sure. Yeah, because I don't think people are aware. No. Not a lot of people are aware of just how much it's affecting. I mean, we like to think we're objective people and we're using our reasoning abilities, but it gets you. Your biases get you. So earlier you kind of talked a little bit about the narrative model. Could you elaborate more on that and how it plays a role in our decision making?
Definitely. So in the context that we were studying it, we wanted to know whether or not jurors were piecing together pieces of evidence in this sort of probabilistic or mathematical way, or were they sort of just assembling the pieces in a way that made sense in a sort of story or narrative. And these two different theories in the legal research world compete against each other. And in our research, we found that it seems to be that people are leaning more towards this narrative aspect, that people are really trying to make sense of information that they're receiving, comparing that information with their past experiences and their values, and trying to construct a cohesive story. Now, we think that this extends beyond juror decision-making, that it can actually be used to explain all kinds of choices. For example, some of the more popular areas where we see sort of a story take off was during the pandemic, when different stocks started to go wild. For example, a lot of people remember GameStop and these market bubbles that prices started to go up for different assets. And they were fueled by online Reddit threads and stories that people were using to inform the decision of whether or not they wanted to make serious investments. So that's one case where we could actually track the sort of structure of a narrative in society and follow it through to its resolution. This happens all the time. It can be used to study vaccine hesitancy or really any kind of misinformation use. So not just how are you constructing and assembling the pieces of information you receive, but then what is the decision you make from that?
Yeah, and I'm sure we all have a story for ourselves, right? And I think that influences how we're going to make a decision and how we see in our future what steps we're going to take towards something based on how we talk or think about ourselves. And so I think that ties a lot into our decision making as well. And I think how you're talking about the narrative model, it's the stories we're telling ourselves.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Castrellon, for joining us today and for taking the time to talk with us and tell us more about your research. Where can our listeners learn more about what you do and your lab?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really always a joy to share the kind of work that we're doing in our lab. They can visit us at our lab website. Sorry, I forgot what the lab website is. It's long. It's like castrellon.psych.ucla.edu.
Gotcha. Awesome.
Maybe we can provide it in a link.
Yeah, we'll add it to the link to our...
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Neurologic, a CVL podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please follow and share with others. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of our team and the incredible work that goes on behind the scenes. We'd like to give special thanks to Patricia Moran for editing this episode. To learn more about the Center for Vital Longevity, just look up cvl.utdallas.edu, and here you'll find information about our research as well as information on how to volunteer to participate in our studies and how to donate to support innovative research to understand, protect, and enhance the vitality of the mind across the lifespan. Join us next time as we continue to explore the latest research and strategies for keeping our brains healthy throughout our lives.